Hi, welcome to CivicList. It's Matthew Camp, and I'm joined by Dr. Rahsaan Harris. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks, Matt.
Great. Really appreciate you being here. Rahsaan runs Citizens Committee for New York City, and you started recently?
So recently, I kind of came to Citizens Committee the same way the pandemic came to New York City because I started on March 16th, the
Wow.
day that the city shut down. So it has been pretty incredible to run the organization during a crisis, which is kind of shadowing to our founding.
Mm, mm. And can you tell a little bit about your founding?
Yeah, so Citizens Committee for New York was founded in 1975 during the fiscal crisis back then. New York City was, I think the technical term of it was like a hot mess. Budgets were bad. The city was in turmoil. The federal government, basically said, you're on your own. And New York City needed someone to step up. And Jacob Javits, the Republican senator, and Osborne Elliott, the founder of Newsweek, got together and got a bunch of their friends together and said, we want to get average, everyday New Yorkers to help improve their neighborhoods and solve problems that they've identified.
Mm.
And in a time of crisis, that's extremely important. And actually, it's an important ongoing endeavor to make sure that New York City lives up to its ideals. And so for 45 years, we've been working to bring New Yorkers together to improve their communities. And we're most proud of the work that takes place in vulnerable neighborhoods.
Right, right. And I know you all host some amazing workshops and community organizing, and I wondered how you see things going forward. You were founded in a crisis, and then you personally started your leadership in another crisis. So I'd like to hear more about what your plans are, for building community in a crisis situation.
Yeah, leadership in crisis is so important, and being willing to step up and to be nimble is critical. When you are dogmatic, you can't necessarily address the most important point. So I think the first thing any good leader does is listen and analyze. And, that's what I would have done if we weren't in crisis, but it's critically important in crisis. Then the second thing I wanted to do was after we've listened to community and analyzed what data was out there, was try to be as supportive and flexible as possible. And after you're flexible, then it's important to hopefully collect information so that you can pivot and improve after that. And in this part, we are collecting a lot of information from our grantee partners to be able to lift up their stories on a citywide level, so that we can aggregate, solutions, we can aggregate concerns, and we can make sure that people aren't invisible. So I'll back up a tiny bit. Citizens Committee was created in crisis, and at that time it was, garbage pickup wasn't happening. Neighborhoods didn't look great. Parks weren't tended to. So the ideas of bringing people together for beautification was a central point, but also giving people other opportunities and addressing needs that they had in their community. I'm assuming for the last 10 years or so, with the onset of understanding of the importance of sustainability and environmentalism, there's been a huge emphasis on Black associations coming together and making community gardens and composting and thinking about sustainability within communities. With COVID, there is a shift to a certain extent, because yes, people are environmentalists, and yes, people care about sustainability, but there are also whole people that COVID has hit New York City, where jobs have gone away, access to food isn't what it used to be, health is in peril. So basic needs have kind of become the focus and the screaming headline of the day. So we have given our groups that might have been Black associations that were beautifying empty lots or doing after school programs. We've given them the chance to talk to us about other things that they're doing. And they're saying that they're assisting old folks to get them food. They're checking in on their neighbors. They're providing, PPE, protective gears and masks. And they're also, providing outlets for folks' mental health. And we're giving them general operating funds so that they can do those projects and be the community leaders that they are. Wow. So to some, that might represent a pivot, because we've been seeing so much as beautifying in parks and community gardens, to now having our organizations take care of like the problems of the day. But the central, kernel, the thread that goes all the way through is we're getting local leaders, hyper local leaders that are on blocks, that are in communities, the ability to be a part of the solution by bringing others together and by trusting them and giving them supports. Hopefully we're unleashing their power in a way that other people couldn't.
That's amazing. Trusting them to be the local leaders, empower, giving resources to pivot from that very local work. Community gardens and beautification work is really a powerful way to bring people together. My first interviewee was River Fields, who was a grantee, young man who's head of his block association, just incredible work. And so, you mentioned leadership too. During challenging times, I wonder what advice you might have for leaders, especially in the nonprofit world, who might be a little bit reluctant to speak out, for political reasons, fear of violating campaign or lobbying laws and things like that. But there's still a lot we could say and do. I wonder if there's any kind of things you might share to help leaders with their voice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. First and foremost, nonprofits, 501c3 organizations, and those that benefit from that, I guess, tax ruling, have a lot of leeway in what they can do to speak to issues. And there's a difference in speaking to an issue and advocating for an issue versus, advocating for a very specific candidate or in some policies. And, I'm not going to be the expert on saying where the line is, but there is a resource, Alliance for Justice. If you Google Alliance for Justice, they tell nonprofits what is possible and what they can do. Education is definitely possible. Nonprofits can educate their constituents, their clients about what decisions that they can make. They can educate them about like what's happening, and so that's not regulated. And figuring out where the line for lobbying is, and making sure that you don't cross, this is something that nonprofits can do. So that's one point. And another point, really specifically, and I'm glad you brought up River Fields. He's actually interning with us in the office right now this summer. He's an amazing young man. He's really talented. And he's another example. So their block association is really about beautifying the block and community gardens and all that space. And, but he's also a young Black man that, in Brooklyn, I believe he lives in Bed-Stuy, and, all that's a part of that. And so recently with the murder of George Floyd and the attention on race relations and folks getting an opportunity to hear from Black people of like what it is to be Black in America, I think, diversity and this commitment to colorblindness has kind of actually silenced and made a lot of people who are right in front of us invisible. And leaders right now are finding their voice. Young River right now is helping us do a survey where we've surveyed New York City leaders and asked them about what they're doing youth services wise, what do they feel about race relations? What do they feel about community police relations? And are people filling out the census? And, those things to some might be like, oh my goodness, that's political. But you know what that is? That's living in society and being engaged. And that's not political. That's just engaging who we are. And knowing the difference, again, between what's lobbying and what's, being partisan versus just educating and providing people the tools to engage in democracy, which is like the foundation of this country. I think that's really important for nonprofit leaders to understand, to have the courage to step out there, and if they don't know, to educate themselves.
A wide range of issues that they can engage in without necessarily, making campaign contributions or something like that. And Citizens Committee is engaging in so many issues. You mentioned mental health and environmental sustainability, racial justice, and so of everything that you work on, what do you think you're most excited about?
I'm excited about, and I think I said this earlier, is really trusting leaders. It's interesting in this Black Lives Matter moment, and I say Black Lives Matter is as a thought of just really understanding and seeing, Black Americans, Blackness in this country, and recognizing that because of our unfortunate history and an unfortunate origin, our origin story has some fatal flaws with our founding fathers and like how we built wealth in this country, that we're finally getting to a point where we're actually being able to examine it in a way that hopefully is not shameful, but allows us to figure out how to move forward together. So I'm excited about like listening in the Black Lives Matter moment to Black leaders and listening to their experience. I'm excited about listening to grassroots leaders in their spaces and in this moment of crisis, and not coming up with some already baked solution that we're trying to experiment on them, but like trusting them and supporting them and providing them a platform. And I think the more that Citizens Committee can do that, identify great leaders, connect them to one another so that their social capital in aggregate is more powerful than they would be by themselves. And then, amplifying some of their voices so that political leaders and key stakeholders in New York City can hear from them and get behind them and make them part of the solutions process is what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I noticed that one of the first things you did when the pandemic hit was do a big survey to find out what was on people's minds, what their needs were. And then it was very clear that those needs and experiences would be shared with elected officials. Is that a way of holding elected officials accountable, or how do we come full circle between sharing what's happening locally, trusting local leaders, and then talking to elected leaders? Is there a way to, like I said, hold them accountable? Or
that's a great question. So accountability, I think first and foremost, there is very little chance of accountability if there's not relationship. So the first thing that I really want to make sure that we continue to do is catalyze and strengthen relationships between local leaders and elected officials. And Citizens Committee has had a great track record of being able to connect with local officials across New York City. And so I really want to make sure that we amplify or even supercharge that part of what we do. And when there's relationship, I think there is a built-in accountability. If you meet across the table with somebody multiple times and you realize that, nothing's changing, I think you recognize, well, something's going to have to change in this equation, because I don't want to keep coming to the same meeting, saying the same thing and getting the same result. That's the definition of insanity. And I think if community members are at the table, then they'll figure what's happening at the table. And if they don't like what's happening at the table, then they'll make different decisions. And or maybe they themselves might decide that they need to start stepping up and throwing their hats in the ring to be the kind of leadership that they think is most needed for the community.
So consistent contact, relationship building is a way of upholding accountability.
Yeah, I think contact, and I think data. Very early with COVID, folks were talking about, X number of New Yorkers died of COVID, but then it's like, okay, so how does that break down on racial and ethnic lines? Like, we don't have that data. So if you don't have that data, you can't keep people accountable, like what are happening in communities of color. If you don't break things down by borough and by neighborhood, you don't understand how you can be intentional in your response. So I think, I don't mean to be too much of a data geek, but, data, if it's not measured, it's not managed. And so I think you need to measure things, and you can see how relationships are improving or how things are getting worse, and like how you need to intervene. And with that management there, I think there can be definitely accountability.
Yeah, it's a good way of keeping track of progress. And like you said, if there's no progress, then something needs to change. So what are you curious about these days?
I'm curious about the future of New York City. It's like, it's kind of almost like a silly thing to say, but specifically, I think it's really important for leaders to think as futurists. Earlier, before, I was like, futurists, those folks are kind of crazy. It's like, the Jetsons or like Back to the Future type thinking. Like, yeah, I'll leave that to the creative, fictional types. But I think the only way out of where we are right now is to be innovative. We need to think about the jobs of the future. We need to think about different revenue possibilities for the city. I think we need to think about how the social safety net works. We need to rethink policing. Are police there to protect who from what and how, or are they there to really kind of facilitate great relationships? And there are definitely different attitudes in policing. If you're looking for something wrong, or if you're spending more time in prevention of something wrong, they're like two different approach. And I'm not necessarily, well, I do have a bias of what I think would probably work best, but I would say that I think there are arguments on both cases, but I think everything needs to be explored. And when people talk about defund the police, I think that is a scary phrase, but I think if it were flipped on its head and saying, let's invest in communities so that police can do their jobs differently, then I think people would approach it differently. And it's like, how do we take care of mental health? How do we take care of this, the surge of homelessness? How do we make sure that people who, coming from different backgrounds and don't have relationship, how do we form relationships so people can be, better neighbors and be, in the same space with one another? And, things like restorative justice and those pieces that aren't so punitive, because, jails end up being, graduate school for criminal behavior. You'll take someone who didn't know much about anything about being a criminal, put them in jail, like you come out with a PhD. So, what are different ways for us to deal with restorative justice, help folks, be in better relationship with their neighbors? And like, how does that affect policing going forward? So there are tons of things for us to think about in a futurist type of way. And like try to make New York City better than she was before is like what I'm really interested in, and like who's going to do it.
It's so great to hear that you're thinking several steps ahead, that this is a crisis, a couple of crises we're facing, that short-term solutions might not really get us very far. So yeah, just a couple more questions. How do you stay motivated?
Oh my gosh. I think about my ancestors. So I'm from New York City, but, I am like you look in a textbook of, people of formerly enslaved folks, like my family story would be in any history book, after the transatlantic, like trade coming through a port in Charleston, South Carolina, I had grandparents that once they were of age got the heck out of Dodge and came up to New York City and had my parents, and a generation later here I am. So I think of the resilience of folks that were living a different life on the continent of Africa, free, and then all of a sudden having that taken away, seeing hundreds, thousands of folks that they care about die, having, families ripped apart. You know, watching 12 Years a Slave and hearing the story of Solomon Northup and thinking about, like, even, so forget about folks that were in slavery and, kind of, one day Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth comes, they're free. But someone that, had freedom, was formerly a slave, and then going back to slavery again and then not giving up hope. All of those things, I just kind of think back to my ancestors and figure out how resilient they were, and recognize that, as bad as things might seem for me, that there's always chance for sunshine to break through. And, I come from people that, had hope when there was no hope. So, I can't be a wimp about it.
So, just the last question, curious about, what do you think a small scale action that everyone could take today would be?
I think, well, I'll say two things. Number one, everyone should vote and or register anyone within their vicinity that is of voting age and eligibility to vote. So that's very simple. If people vote and educate themselves, think nationally for sure, but even more importantly, locally, then they can see how they can really implement change. Local elections are won by so few votes that if more people voted, like, you could really move some things. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, I think, thinking about so many people unemployed right now, I really want people to support local businesses. And I'll start with Black businesses. We were talking about Black Lives Matter, and you looked at the federal response to the current economic crisis to help small businesses, like Black and Latino businesses were getting like denied at literally like above 90% of their applications. So they don't have access to capital. They already had, very weak relationships with banks at best. So I think if folks supported, Black businesses, people of color owned businesses, women owned businesses, like local businesses, then people will start getting money moving within neighborhoods, and then neighborhoods could come back. But without the money, it's going to be really, really difficult.
Those are great actions, yeah. So anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
I would love people to get to know Citizens Committee. I would love people to check out Citizens Committee. It's citizensnyc.org. At the very least, sign up for our mailing list. We have great community resources there. There will be opportunities for folks to apply for local grants for their local community. And more and more, we're doing community surveys. So there'll be opportunity for you to lend your voice so that we know what you're thinking, so that we can let stakeholders and local elected officials know how to best address your needs, and also to highlight the wonderful things that you're doing.
Yeah, Citizens Committee, also very biased, but I can't say enough good about it. And you guys are doing amazing work. And there's money available for small and local organizations. So we'll definitely give that a shout out to you on CivicList. So thank you so much. I guess we could stop the recording, and that's a wrap.